Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Iron Culture. It is me, Eric Trexler, the only Eric today. Eric Helms essentially refused to be part of this podcast interview. Mark, something you should know is that Eric Helms and I co-host Iron Culture, and at every possible opportunity, he tries to come in and give all sorts of sporting updates about a powerlifting program on this side of the world, a powerlifting competition on this side of the world, an Olympic weightlifting competition over here. So he's all about detailed rundowns of the results of these true iron sports. And I try to take every opportunity to work in American football. That is my first love as a guy from Ohio. So every time I start talking about football, he glazes over. Sometimes I feel like one of these days he's just going to leave. So he's actually traveling right now, but I figured while he's gone, I'm going to take advantage and we're going to talk a little bit of football. So that brings me to our guest for tonight, the esteemed Dr. Marc Lewis. He's the Director of Applied Sports Science for the Houston Texans. That's an NFL team here in the U.S. for our international listeners. And so Houston's not your first stop. You've been doing sports science and strength and conditioning stuff all over the place: Wake Forest, Virginia Tech, Penn State, and now, of course, in the NFL with the Houston Texans. And according to your bio, this job involves overseeing the collection, management, and analysis of data to inform decision-making to maximize player performance and availability. So, Mark, first and foremost, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Eric. Really excited.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to have you on because I talk more than I should about data and statistics, so in the universe of evidence-based fitness content, there's going to be some people who talk a lot of physiology, some people who talk a lot of, in the trenches training type stuff. I spend more time than anyone would advise talking about data and statistics because it's what excites me. So I like to kind of take that approach. And man, if I knew about the field of sports science when I was growing up, there's about a 99.9% chance I would have been on that trajectory from day one. Just for a little insight, I always felt like I wanted to be a strength coach. And in my mind, my idea of a strength coach was a man who quietly walks around with a clipboard and takes meticulous notes and basically studies the athletes as if they were research participants, very quietly, goes back to his lab, assembles these brilliant ideas, builds these incredible protocols. And then I spent one moment in actual strength and conditioning circles and realized, this doesn't really work so great for quiet introverts like myself. So strength coaching was a little bit more, it's intense, it's in your face. And I was like, I'm not sure if this is really the right fit for my temperament. But sports science, the first question I have for you is very simply, what is the day-to-day life of a sports scientist working at the highest level of sport?
Sure. Yeah. So I think you kind of hit on a lot of it, but I like to look at what I do broadly as my job is to create and implement effective systems that help us make more informed and hopefully better decisions. And that's a lot of times collecting information and then leveraging that information to have insight to help inform decisions. And so we collect data, we do these different things, we manage the data, we analyze the data, but what really makes, I think where you really go from being good to great and what really differentiates an average sports scientist from a great sports scientist is really being able to take that information and help provide insight with how it can be leveraged for action. So what intervention are we going to do? What recommendations can we make? How is this information actually going to help the athlete? And then making decisions around that athlete to help them maximize performance and availability. And so that's really what, big picture, what I do here with the Texans. And so, when we get into the day-to-day, it's really around understanding how we're collecting the information, making sure that we're collecting high-quality data that's reliable, that is consistent. So different types of validity, different types of reliability. So I'm just going to use these terms broadly, but in our setting, when you're in an applied setting, there's different factors. And when you use terms like reliability and validity, sometimes obviously the type is a little different that we focus on in an applied setting versus being in a lab in a controlled environment. And so for me, I always say I want it to be repeatable, sustainable, and scalable. And for that, so how we collect our information, making sure that there's protocols written out for how we test, monitor our athletes, whether we're looking at how fast they're running, their accelerations or decelerations, how much distance they're covering, or whether we're talking about looking at the way they produce force, how fast they produce that force in a given movement, whether we're looking at all the different components of isolated testing of the posterior chain, the groin musculature, whatever it is. My job is to make sure that that information is collected in a way that's repeatable, that provides really high quality information, and that's sustainable over time, because the power in our information is that it's collected consistently over time, and that lets us investigate trends and actually understand what's happening, and then also be able to more confidently detect when meaningful change occurs. And then, so collection of data, then we talk about the management of data. So making sure that we're collecting all this information consistently over time. We want to make sure that that information is managed well. The quality of the data, over time, ultimately sits in one place, allows us to pull data efficiently, that data is accurate, and that ultimately all the different information streams that we're collecting can be brought together for the last part where we're talking about analysis, which is we're taking some type of analytical approach to answer some type of question. And whatever the analytical approach, which we determine the most appropriate approach based on the question we're trying to answer, the type of data we're dealing with, things like that. And then we analyze that information. And that information, once analyzed, you visualize it in different ways. And ultimately, what we're trying to do with the visualization is tell a story. We're trying to tell a story around the information. Now, all of these things, like I kind of opened with, all these things are very important for collecting information, storing information, and then analyzing that information. But what makes my job special and what I love the most about my work, and I think any sports scientist would say the same, is that, yes, I'm overseeing all of that. I'm meticulous in how we do these things. But the fun part, and the part that really excites you, especially if you're a problem solver and someone who likes to understand numbers beyond just whatever output you're getting, is taking that information and then figuring out what's going on with the athlete. Because I'm taking loading information. So we think about external load, which is just simply the work done by the athlete. We're taking different types of monitoring data from like a performance task standpoint. So like a double leg counter movement jump, a Nordic, an iso prone, which is basically just a long lever posterior chain test, things like that. So I like to think about that as that's insight into how they're responding to that load. And then we collect subjective information like wellness questionnaire, which gets in more to some of the non-training related factors that influence recovery. So things like sleep, things like mood state, things like sleep quality, sleep quantity, those kind of factors. And then ultimately like insight into that. So thinking about how these different factors influence recovery, and then also self-reported things like muscle soreness, general muscle fatigue. And then we take all that information and then situate it to the individual athlete. So we consider factors like the age of the athlete, previous injury history, their position played, or as we've referred to it a lot of times, job description, what they're asked to do on game day. And then take all these factors and then you look at the information and try to determine the best decision. Sometimes it's at the individual level. Sometimes that individual level informs a team level. Sometimes it's at the team level, and then that informs the individual level. And so it's really just dependent upon what you're looking at. But ultimately, again, the fun part for me, taking all that information and seeing how it influences the athlete and how we can make better decisions around them, with the ultimate goal of maximizing their performance and reducing the likelihood of injury or maximizing availability, however you want to say that. And so I think with that is in kind of what we were talking about when you were kind of opening with your view of strength conditioning, and things like that is, something that I've found. And one thing I love about my work and as my career's progressed is understanding and really being able to influence holistic performance and thinking about all the things that performance, that term, really entails. And I think if a lot of your listeners, whether you're a power lifter, physique competitor, a bodybuilder, whatever it is, you think about that in terms of what you're doing in the gym, what you're doing when you're at home, what you're eating, how you're sleeping, life stressors. So what's going on, with your social life, your work life, how that impacts your gym, what you're doing in the gym, your performance in different lifts, how that impacts your sleep, all of these factors, and then all the different ways you can monitor that throughout your training.
Yeah, I mean, that's first of all, thank you. That's a fantastic overview. And, I've had the privilege of being able to kind of be a fly on the wall with some pretty substantial, data collection operations in the field of applied sports science. And it is so different from, my main area of kind of experience is doing lab-based exercise science research, where comparatively speaking, we have very few data points, right? You might do a crossover trial with 20 participants. You measure the performance indicator pre and post. You do it again with the next condition that they do. So when you start putting together this data sheet, it's a small amount of data. And one of the things that really struck me, watching, in sports science, especially in American football, most established programs are going to have a handful of tools that they rely on. They'll mix and match from place to place, but you're going to have tremendous, just vast amounts of GPS data. You're going to have a considerable amount of force plate data. You're going to have some isometric testing. There's all these different data inputs. And then you add in subjective surveys and questionnaires, information from the sports medicine team. And, a lot of times in small sample research, exercise science, as our big thing is we're self-conscious about our lack of data. It's hard to generate data. And in sports science, it's almost the inverse, where you feel like the data are there. I think NFL, what do they do? 54-man rosters? Is that right? The final
With
roster?
the 53-man active roster. Yeah, that's like the 53, but then obviously the roster is bigger when you think practice squad and other elements.
Right.
But yes, 53.
So they're gonna be wearing what they're told to wear, in terms of when you're getting your GPS stuff, if they need to come in and do some force plate testing, they're gonna be there. And same thing, with college teams. Now we're talking about teams with, 85 scholarship guys. All the stuff's changing. Everything's in flux in college sports. But we're talking about for a football team, you got 100 guys coming through the door, and so all this data is being generated day after day after day. And rather than, trying to find the signal in this tiny amount of data, now we're trying to find the needle in the haystack. And so one of my big questions for you being a sports scientist with all this data being generated on a daily basis is, how do you decide with this huge amount of data where you need to be looking in order to create those kind of actionable interventions and recommendations? Because at the end of the day, you have to be, your goal is not to collect data. Your goal is to act upon that data in an insightful way that is ultimately beneficial in terms of performance and availability. So do you find more often than not it's a player that kind of gets circled as, hey, we need to double check what's going on for this guy? Is it a top-down thing where the coach has a question about how load is being managed and, hey, we're looking flat, what's going on here? Like, how do you, or is it just something where you are literally, you've kind of got that like spider sense, like from Spider-Man, where the certain guys that you need to be checking up on more closely? Or is it really as daunting as just saying, for every single player, we're going to be doing some kind of cursory review every day of their individual trends? So how do you decide with this huge mountain of data where to kind of zone in and decide, hey, we need some extra evaluation here?
Oh, that's a really great question, Eric. So, I think that's also, it's fun and it's great to have that. And like you noted, I kind of grew up, I had one foot in the research lab and like exercise physiology labs, and then one foot in the weight room my entire time in undergrad and grad school and how that evolved. So I was used to very much, I understood research methodology, measurement theory, things like that, but with small sample sizes, where we're doing crossover design. You're taking this supplement. My first publication was on dietary nitrate supplementation in COPD patients. And so it's like I think our sample size was 11 or something. And so it's like, to your point, it's going through the data and sorting through the data and understanding what variables to analyze and things like that. That's not the challenge. And so in our space, that is very much the challenge. And I think a lot of times for sports scientists, they can get lost in the noise. And so really our challenge and what I'm trying to do is I'm always trying to find the signal within the noise. And so to do that, and you use the example of GPS. So these positional tracking systems, they generate a lot of different metrics. There's really 4 tools within these devices that are worn. Generally, folks will see them in the upper back between the scapulae. And, there's 4 tools within that to where you get a lot of different metrics outside of just max velocity and running distance and things like that people know about. So you get so many metrics, you can't possibly try to truly monitor all of those, nor are all of those really relevant. And so part of what you have to do is understand and decide what metrics you're going to monitor and understand and obviously have some rationale for why you're going to monitor those. And there are many different ways to do that. First and foremost, you should always look at the literature and understand what's out there, because metrics, just like we talked about earlier, metrics need to be reliable. And so if you've got a metric that's, and I'll use an example. So like high intensity decelerations, that's a sexy metric. Decelerating in field-based team sport, training it, monitoring it, but it also has a lot of measurement error in measuring that because it's tough to measure, similar to like rate of force development on a force plate in something like a counter movement jump. So those things need to be taken into consideration. Those factors need to be taken into consideration when looking at whether you're going to monitor that metric or not. The other thing that you really have to consider is what's appropriate based on the physical demands of their sport or their position. So in American football, for example, it's, within the sport, you have all these different positions and you can watch the game and you don't have to know anything else about football. And you can watch the game and say, all of these guys aren't the same. It's not soccer where across the field, there's similarity in their physiques, their speed, what they do. Outside of the goalie, everyone else, you're like, okay, yeah, it's similar-ish. You're not going to make the mistake if you look at American football. You watch one play, you're like, yeah, some of these guys are not like the others.
This guy weighs 190 pounds soaking wet. This guy weighs 340, right? They're not doing the same thing. Yeah,
exactly. And you can watch the plays. So understanding what they're doing in the physical demands of their sport help inform what metrics are most worthwhile to monitor. And then you can take data sets and do different types of analyses with them. So something like this, you could do an exploratory factor analysis, where basically it sorts through and groups metrics based on similarity of the metrics and then orders them based on the amount of variance they explain within the data set. But again, you can do that on your own data, but also there's research out there, there's published papers that do that within different sports. So again, in-house research you can do, consulting the literature, understanding the physical demands of the sport just from the coach sense. So all these different factors you consider. But the main goal is to distill it down to the metrics that matter the most. Determine what matters, measure what matters, impact what matters. And that's really what it comes down to. And so whether it's GPS, force plates, the way I look at it, I have a framework that helps guide my decision-making around athlete monitoring for how I select what tools I'm going to utilize. And I'll use this example. So the framework that helps guide these decisions, I developed the framework to be placed in any sport, to where you can walk into a sport you've never worked in, and it's your job to consider those factors and then what tool to use in each construct of the framework. And it's basically training load, objective response indicators, subjective response indicators, and intrinsic athlete factors. So related to everything I covered, that's the 4 construct framework that I utilize when in athlete monitoring. And so you get a tool out of each one, and then you determine the metrics that matter, and then you measure those and track those over time. To your point about the amount of data you sift through and how ultimately you're determining those questions to answer those things. It's a little bit of an art and science in that you have to understand everything specific to your organizational context, your team context. So you walk into it, you're working with an organization, coaches, executives, staff members, whatever your team is, they're going to have different questions, different prior experiences that influence how they look at things. Part of your job is to ask questions, understand their positionalities, understand their previous experiences, and understand what they're really, because a lot of times they'll have things that they're asking, and what they're actually wanting to know isn't what they think it is. And so you really have to ask questions, peel back the layers, and understand what they're trying to get at. And then the other piece is you should have, from your understanding of physiology, biomechanics, the sport, all of these different factors, you should have an idea of what information is going to be most helpful to make decisions to maximize performance and availability. And so you take that together and you piece together, okay, these are the different data points, information streams that I'm going to look at to help supply this information, and you merge that with these are the things they're interested in. This is the information they're really wanting to know. And you always have to, and I tell young sports scientists this, students, whenever I'm talking, like, you always have to meet people where they are. You could be the best sports scientist in terms of, like, you have all the technical knowledge, you have everything, all the resources. If you go into an environment and you have this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it this way, and on this timeline, and this is the way it's going to be. 9 times out of 10, that's going to be a recipe for disaster. So part of your job as a sports scientist that goes beyond the quantitative pieces and things like that is really understanding people, human relationships, understanding organizational context, being able to meet people where they are and understand how to bring value given whatever set of constraints you're placed in. Yeah. And that's really part of that art and science I've referred to a couple of times now with being a sports scientist in an applied setting.
Yeah, and to me, that's one of the most refreshing things about, high-level sport. Mark, you work in a multi-billion-dollar industry. I don't know if you noticed, the NFL makes some money, right? The stakes are high, all right?
I heard something about that.
Yeah. I was just watching a documentary about Jerry Jones and the Cowboys. Apparently, there's money in the sport. I didn't know. Even in a collegiate sport at the high levels, it's serious stuff. The stakes are high. One of the things I find so refreshing about it is getting away from academic publishing and getting into that applied setting. All that matters is being good. And like you said, the organizational context, it is such a simple way of visualizing what is my role here. Well, we have a game on Saturday, and the coaches are going to call the plays and make personnel decisions, and the athletes are going to go move the ball up and down the field or try to stop it from moving. So my utility here is fully limited by the way I can impress upon the athletes and the coaches the most insightful information I can get out of this data. And within that framework, it's very refreshing to get into a spot where it is very clear what everybody's objective is. It's very clear how you make an impact there, and everyone has their eyes fixed on the same goal, And so one of the things I love about applied sports science is that people come into it with a level of intellectual humility that I think is really refreshing when you contrast it with kind of like higher education academia, because in academia there's kind of like a process for shifting a paradigm or changing the evidence in this kind of very slow, incremental, foolproof kind of way. Um, but in many cases, academics will fall into this trap where there's only one form of evidence they acknowledge, which is happening in peer-reviewed literature. If I can't, find it in a peer-reviewed article, then as far as I know, it's not useful to me, which is such a strange way of thinking. And in applied sports science, you have people like you who are completely up to date with the literature, scouring the literature on a regular basis to say, hey, I don't have eyes everywhere. Of course, I want to use the research that's available so I don't have to figure out every single thing independently. But at the same time, you have to, in order to do your job well, you have to incorporate experience. You have to develop, frankly, I mean, I'm kind of speaking at you. I would imagine this is relatively on par with what you'd suggest, but you kind of almost have to develop heuristics, so to speak, of like, with this metric, I want to see it in this range, because I know, based on working in this field for 6 years, when this metric gets out of this range, only bad things happen, right? Or the risk of bad things happening goes way up. So it's really cool to see people who love data-driven insights, but they're also free to break away from the kind of, published literature and say, we're going to incorporate that to the extent it's useful, but we're also going to keep our eyes and ears open and learn as we go. And I think what's really cool about that is every time you drop in on a new group of sports scientists, the institutional knowledge that they've been cultivating is really, really cool to tap into. Because ultimately, if they're worth a damn, like, they should have information that frankly no one else in the world has yet. You know what I mean? Like, just
Absolutely.
with the sheer volume and frequency of data collection. So it's just super cool to see how people will arrive at these insights, develop their heuristics, and I bet the literature will ultimately, years down the line, kind of reinforce some of those heuristics, the way people are operating day to day. But at the end of the day, you don't have time, right? There's a game on Saturday, there's a game on Sunday. We have to figure out what works now and keep moving with it and keep building that knowledge. Now, along those lines, you started with a strength and conditioning background. You mentioned you did some exercise science. I didn't know that you were a dietary nitrate guy. That's what my dissertation was on. So we have a connection there. But when you started kind of making that shift from strength and conditioning into applied sports science, one of my big questions is like, what are some of the biggest insights that changed some of your pre-existing perspectives related to like training, recovery, strength and conditioning? Like, if you were to go back to your early strength and conditioning coach self, after you've built this wealth of knowledge through sports science, do you think there's anything you would have done differently as a coach in the day-to-day with your programming?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'll touch on a couple of things and kind of lead into that. So yes, so throughout my undergrad, I was in the military prior to college. Throughout my undergrad, my grad school, I came into school out of the military to study the human body and the body's response to exercise, to train. And so I didn't know I wanted to be a sports scientist. That job wasn't even something that I saw. And
Yeah,
to your
what
point
year?
earlier, so I started college in 2010 because I was in the military prior to that. So coming out through those, like, there was no, there were sports scientists, but in the United States, they weren't visible. And there certainly, it certainly wasn't prevalent. Most teams did not have, a lot of teams still do not have sports scientists. So it's a growing field. So I didn't know that job existed. And coming out of the military, going to college, I just knew I loved physical preparation. I loved training. I loved understanding the body's response to different types of stressors. And I knew I became very interested. I won't say I knew, I became very interested in research methodology, statistics, learning in the academic setting. I love to read. I love to read literature. I love to read books. On my last combat deployment, I had kind of discovered that you can go to school and major in exercise physiology. I just poured through like the Powers of Halley text. I was just reading. I wasn't in school. I was on COTS and Fallujah, just reading through physiology and biomechanics books. and anatomy books, and half of it I didn't understand, but I was piecing it together, no background. And so that said this hunger I had for that. And so when I got to school, I loved to study. I loved to read. I loved to be in the lab. And so any research, it didn't even have to be something that was pertaining to performance. I just wanted to be part of it. My undergrad honors research, I was going back and looking at my poster at ACS the other day, and it was inspiratory muscle training, the inner rate of reliability of inspiratory muscle training in the critically ill population. And so nothing to do with performance, but the power in that is understanding research methodology, measurement theory, statistics, how to answer questions in a methodical way, the scientific method, like these kind of concepts, these kind of things help. But in the same time, I kept one foot over, in the weight room, on the field, on the track, working with anything I could get, interning, wherever I was in school at the time. And then at the same time, personal training people in the gym, training myself, but training others, training old ladies, training younger people, high school students, whatever. So I had a foot in both. And so I really got introduced to the world of sports science in an internship at US Ski and Snowboard. Center for Excellence in Park City, Utah is really where I got introduced to that. And I went to, it's a performance mecca, and you've got sport psychologists, sport physiologists, the great Bill Sands. You've got strength conditioning coaches. You've got chefs, the nutrition piece, dietitians, but also chefs that are also RDs. Like, you've got everybody under one roof. And that's where I really got introduced to this world of sports science. Also the world of high performance and what that could look like, right? To kind of answer your question, the more I learned things outside of traditional strength conditioning, and the more I learned about performance as a whole. And when you get into sports science, and I think as you become more advanced in sports science, you really start understanding all the different things that impact acute response to stress, but also chronic adaptations, the different factors to consider. And you understand beyond just things that are, come out of the essentials of strength conditioning text, where it's just, programming, and you're thinking everything's in the weight room is what I need to focus on. And if I do this, this will happen. But within sports science, you actually see in the data and start understanding how much variability there are between people and their response to the same thing, and all the different factors that influence that response. So to answer your question on what I would go back and tell myself is to take a step back and try to understand the big picture. Coming up in S&C and being around strength coaches, you're obsessed with weight room. You're obsessed with periodization and programming and technique and all of these different things, which is great. There definitely needs to be learning and development in that area. However, sometimes you neglect these other things, right? Sometimes you neglect really being able to step back and consider these other factors, consider all these other things, learn in different areas that really influence everything you're doing in the weight room, because that's a small portion of time. And so I think really going back and telling myself I would look at it differently. I would look at performance differently. I would probably spend more time. And if you work strength conditioning in team sport, I think you should really spend a lot of time watching and studying the sport itself and understand where the weight room fits into the sport. And so that kind of feeds into this as well, is that I would remind myself of that. I didn't really understand that for a long time. And I think a lot of strength coaches don't. We think, we focus on, the need to squat and, the need to do this exercise or that exercise or whatever it is. But a lot of times I think, we hyper focus on those things, and we overvalue these different types of lifts or things done in the weight room. That's a small piece to it. There are many methods to do things, understanding where that fits in the big picture of performance.
Yeah. That brings up a question that I'm sure many of our listeners wrestle with, which Something that's always struck me as interesting is in the evidence-based fitness world, there's a lot of talk, or especially, if you go back like 5 or 10 years, there was a lot of talk about overtraining. And there'd be a lot of talk about how folks need to really thread the needle in terms of you need to be pushing this hard in the gym, but no harder. You really being cautious of this kind of upper ceiling of what you can recover from. But it strikes me that a lot of that information largely trickles out from strength and conditioning coaches. And what's interesting about that is a lot of them are working with team sport athletes who are spending multiples more time playing their sport, being on the field, doing agility, sprint, conditioning, all this other stuff. And the weight room is, like you said, an important piece, but a relatively small piece of the total training stress and the total training load. And so my question is, this is like a very applied question, but I think our audience will get a lot out of it. As a person who now spends a lot of time quantifying loads and has, done that in the weight room, on the field, and more importantly, the combination of the two, how do you compare and contrast the prevalence of people who legitimately are pushing way too hard on the field and people who are legitimately pushing way too hard in the weight room? Because the thing that I'm kind of getting at here is there's a lot of people who are very terrified about pushing too hard in the gym, but they exercise 60 minutes a day in a weight room, and they're behind a desk for the other, either behind a desk, sitting or sleeping for the other 23 hours. So, how do you kind of compare the degree to which these two different elements actually have the capacity to really push people over the edge such that they need to be worried about that balance of training stress and recovery?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say too that you're spot on in team sport. And even think about it in terms of just logically think about it. I think some people don't appreciate enough the demands placed on the body when you're sprinting, when you're in football, when you have collisions, when you're running, jumping, when you're doing these things. It's experience.
Decelerate.
Exactly. Decelerate. Exactly. The forces experienced by the body, the mechanical stress that results in the tissue and in the joints, like comparing to things you can do in the weight room, you're not doing things in the weight room that's replicating the types of velocities that you're going to be expressing on a field. To your point, in a hard deceleration, when you're sprinting and you're putting on the brakes within, you've got a big entrance velocity, you're putting on the brakes within 2 to 3 yards and redirecting body mass. Or when you're talking about those big guys, when you're colliding with someone and you've got you're expressing force in essentially an isometric position against another human, and then you're trying to manipulate their body mass. Things like this, or whether you look at basketball, when you're jumping a volleyball, the stress that places on the joints, and then you consider what that looks like in the weight room, it's very different. And things you do in the weight room, you're not touching those types of velocities, that type of force that experienced by the body. And I think appreciating that, and I think sometimes, to your point, we are weight room focused and we're thinking about what's being done there and not really truly understanding until you quantify it, see the values, and truly understand what that means when athletes are out there doing their sport. And then you think about the longevity, and then you think about the fact that, they're doing these ballots consistently over long periods of time, the type of stress experienced. And we've not even touched environmental stress, some of these other stress that also impacts what you're doing. Right. Yeah. So it's like when we think about it, the amount of stress experienced by our body when doing this, very, very different. And so that's the stress that you're really trying to modulate, that you're really trying to understand how to appropriately dose, and you're trying to understand how to undulate over time to make sure that you're allowing athletes to recover adequately, but also be stressed enough that they're prepared for what they're going to see in games, and that you're preparing them to be robust over a long season, whatever your season is. those factors. And so, to your point about folks that train, 5 days in the gym, 60, and in the meantime, they're doing contrast therapy and Normatec boots and worried about overtraining and all these things. I think sometimes the general person underestimates the stress they can put on their body as long as it's done incrementally. You progress to what you're doing. You're smart about it, obviously. You underestimate the amount of stress you can put on your body, recover from, adapt to, and become more robust over time. Again, as long as you're appropriately doing that, as you program your own training. And I think we sometimes overvalue the amount of stress that it places doing something in a gym, moving a barbell, or machine, something like that, compared to what we see done in sport, especially at the different levels, right? It's incredible. So yeah, that's an excellent point. And the term overtraining really gets thrown around loosely, and you'll appreciate this as a physiologist, Eric, but like the overtraining literature, overtraining is something that's rarely truly seen. It's a continuum and it's rarely seen. And even when it is seen, there's a whole level of understanding the criteria that goes into truly having overtraining syndrome, and that being a diagnosis, and truly being overtrained, and really, like that's a rarity, to be honest. And then you appreciate that, but I think a lot of times people throw that out there and what they understand of what the symptoms would be if you're truly overtrained. And even when you go into non-functional overreaching, which is before a precursor to overtraining, if you think about it on a continuum, right? It's like that's the symptoms you see and the different performance decrements and some of the other physiological indicators you're going to see. Most people won't experience that, and it's not something they've seen.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that always intrigues me as a person who now kind of communicates in this kind of like science adjacent fitness world is how messaging from one context permeates into another and how that can cause some misconception. So a great example is, I kind of come from a physique sport background, like bodybuilding and stuff. The number of practices in natural bodybuilding that bled through from steroid using bodybuilders is really astounding. And what's interesting is a lot of the bodybuilders who compete naturally never question, wait a minute, why are we doing this? And so like all these aggressive water cutting protocols before competition are because the people on PEDs are retaining a lot of water from their PEDs. A lot of the like old like recommendations to like carb load after your workouts, it's like that's when people were taking their insulin after their workouts, and so they needed the 120 grams of carbohydrates so they didn't go into a diabetic coma, from injecting a bunch of insulin. So in a similar, less extreme but similar way, it seems that a lot of folks carry over a lot of this overtraining concern into a pretty typical fitness program. And they forget that a lot of that overtraining stuff is people, first of all, like you said, true overtraining is rare. You'd be hard pressed to find a documented instance of it in a person who's just lifting weights and eating a normal diet. Like I venture to say it essentially has not been observed, at least in the literature. I'm not saying it can't be achieved, but I've not seen it. I always try to bring this up so that people really get the impression of, first of all, not setting super low limitations, because I've had clients who come to me in the past, and when I tell them that we are going to train for a 5th week straight in the gym and not do a deload after number 4, they go, Jesus Christ, what are we doing here? Like, this guy's a madman. I'm like, what are you talking about? They're like, the human body cannot tolerate 5 weeks in a row of lifting weights. Everyone knows this. You need your deload after 4 weeks. And so like, you can tell that they've been in some area of the internet where there's a ton of misconceptions about just what the body can tolerate. And I think it's just incredible. Like you said, I mean, when you start thinking about the total stress in terms of training load and non-training stressors of, you've got an elite athlete who may be playing for their livelihood. They could be a fringe person who, if they have a bad game, they literally may get cut from the roster, right? And now you're talking about, you got to fly over to the East Coast for this game on a Monday night. Then we have a quick turnaround for a Sunday game on the West Coast. I mean, the amount of stress that's going on there, they're playing under the lights with, 7 million people watching the game. There is so much more to the picture than just like, oh man, if I do 4 sets instead of 3, I'm really going to be screwed, But like you said, it's all about kind of acclimating with graded exposure up to that training load. But that reminds me. So on the topic of some of these kind of like the tendency to kind of set a low ceiling for what's possible, what we're capable of. I wonder now that you're working, I've had little glimpses into NFL athletes or high level combine prospects who are going to be in the NFL. And I know that the first time I started interacting with that population of people, it was a little jarring. If you go from like a general fitness population and now you're interacting with the best of the best of the best, how was that? Were there any instances when you first got into it where you're like, everything I thought I knew about the human body is fake, and these people are truly just fundamentally different from your average person, just in terms of their capability and capacity?
Yeah, yeah. And I was coming from high level collegiate football, and so and you can kind of see it developing. Like you'll see, like you can be even at the most premier university, and you can tell the dudes, right? Like that guy's gonna be yeah. And so you can tell that. But when you get to the league, it's that's everywhere, right? And it's incredible, and what they can do is incredible. It's and I think that's part of what makes this fun, right? It's like you're getting to see some of the best athletes perform. You're getting to see the extremes of what's there, the rarity, right? It's that's tremendous, and you get to see things that most people can't see up close, and most people that work in physical preparation in the performance realm don't get to work with these populations of athletes. And so I think it's just tremendous to see what they can do. I think, it's in our sport. I think sometimes one of the realest moments you'll get is transitioning from a collegiate football sideline to an NFL sideline. So when you're first seeing how fast these guys are going and how impactful the collisions are, and like how fast the game is. The game in the NFL compared to college is so much faster. Not only faster in how the athletes are moving in terms of the velocity they're moving, but their reaction, what's happening, and how much faster they have to be to understand schematically what's happening, to make reads, to do these different things. Like the game is just so fast. And so it's not only the physical pieces, but it's also paired with their understanding of their job, of what they're being asked to do, and being able to do it very, very quickly. It's incredible. And so I think it's something that you never lose an appreciation for. I think it's for us that have studied the human body, that have devoted so much time to learning and doing, like, you get to do this, you get to be in this environment, and you just appreciate that piece of it. But I think, again, like that's another piece that, you don't truly understand until you get to experience it firsthand.
Yeah. No, I remember, I published a paper about fat-free mass index in American football players, right? And so we were looking at college players of some different competitive levels. And I was like, this is so cool. We finally have access to study these athletes who are legitimately huge people. Like, if you want to find how big can people get, go there. And I was a little deflated as a grad student because we published the paper and everyone, but not everyone, but a small minority, but vocal minority, said that research is useless because everyone knows all these guys are on steroids because no one could ever get that big without them. And I was like, man, first of all, not true. Second of all, it really sucks that it's so hard to convey to people. Like, it should be obvious, but like the people that are on NFL sidelines are not your neighbors. You know what I mean? These are not your buddies you train with in college. And I just remember, it's one thing to say, yeah, we have, high level NFL hopeful D1 players and they're huge, like, SEC, ACC guys. But I remember doing some testing associated with retired NFL players. And these guys would walk in, and I would do a DEXA scan for them and talk to them about their training, their nutrition. These guys would come in looking just absolutely jacked. And I'm like, some guys have all the luck, you know? So, and I'm talking to them, I'm like, so what's your training program like? And they will look me dead in the eye, Mark, and they will say, I have not touched a weight since I retired 7 years ago. And I'm like, bro, if I looked like you, I would consider myself in the shape of my life, you know? And that's as a person who had been competing in bodybuilding for 5 years at that point. So it's so hard to kind of convey to people like the spectrum of human capability when it comes to some of these physical traits and the athletic tasks that an NFL player actually does on a regular basis. And they make it look simple. And you're like, dude, like, you know, we're starting to see these crazy 40 times from defensive tackles that weigh 340 pounds. And you're like, what do you mean you ran a 4.8 or a 4.9? Like, it just doesn't make any sense, you know? But yeah, my biggest thing with that is just, it is so incredible to get those little opportunities to have that glimpse of like, oh, this is performance. Like, this is what it's all about if you push it to the absolute extreme. But that's got to bring its host of challenges, right? I mean, when you're talking about a body capable of that level of power, I would imagine it gets all the more important to make sure that you have at least a little bit of pressure on the brakes, right? I mean, because that it's not normal to be able to put your body through that amount of power creation and the forces and the collisions. So it seems to me like, did you notice jumping from college to pro that you had to be even a little bit more like kind of foot on the brake pad of like, now we have the capacity to push things even further, you know, and we need to rein that in a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's, in college, you might be dealing with one or two guys like that and, you know, a handful, but in the NFL setting, as you alluded to, like you're having to very much, and I would say the considerations that go into everything, understanding, you know, the capacity that's there and how you need to be very careful when you're pushing that, because when you push it, they'll go. Man, that's the thing, right? They have the capacity and it can happen fast.
Yeah, like you don't want bald tires on a car that can go 200 miles an hour, right? Like you got to really mind the details when you're talking about that level of capacity.
Exactly. That's the whole, and that's the thing. You have to be very, very careful. And that's also to kind of bring in something I mentioned earlier, trying to take all the information in to consider the best decision to be made. And I'll use something simple here. You know, we're talking about, okay, it's commonly known now really that, you know, we want to maintain some exposure of high velocity exposure for hamstring health, right? And so that's something that is very common, done across all team sports. But how meticulous that has to be in this environment, just understanding all the considerations. Does this guy have anything that's bothering him? An ankle, a knee, something that might compromise his movement pattern? Is, you know, what's his sleep been like? What is like, because their capacity, their ceiling is much higher, and the cost with that effort is much greater than what you might have seen in other settings. So it's like you have to consider all of these things, not even to mention the type of value that's placed in these athletes in our setting, right?
Yeah.
It's like in college, the numbers you have, which you know, we mentioned earlier, and the difference between 1, 2, 3, so forth. Like obviously you're going to have your exceptions, but here it's everything, right? And so how careful you have to be, all the factors you have to consider, you know, the framework I spoke of earlier, all of these different information streams that come in from these, it's 4 constructs, the tools you pick. Part of the reason those constructs, they're related but distinct, right? So that means that the information coming from these constructs provide distinct insight, something that's related but distinct. So a different piece of information, a different type of information. The idea is to take all of these together to understand, okay, sleep? How are they reporting from soreness fatigue? What are we seeing in the performance tasks? What's their loading been like? What's their injury history? All these considerations to really be able to understand, okay, we can push a little now. We're in a good spot. I've checked everything. There's still more risk with this, but everything, I've exhausted all avenues, and I feel like this is a good decision here, that we can push a little bit. But to your point, like, my approach overall is much more conservative than in the college environment. And that's, as you were referencing, pushing on the brakes more, much more conservative. And the amount of time that goes into making what someone might think is a very simple decision, just to make sure that I've thought and considered everything, including even potential unintended consequences, all of these different things. It's again, like, just much more conservative overall.
Yeah, and it's a lot like lifting, right? So you always are thinking about the context of the lifter. So if someone comes to you and says, hey, do you think I can do heavy squats and deadlifts in the same session? You might say, well, I mean, you're a beginner. Like, I'm not sure you're quite ready for that, nor do you really need it at this point in your development. Same question. I'm an intermediate lifter and I'm on a time crunch. Like, yeah, we can squeeze them in. That's no big deal. So the answer goes from probably no to probably yes. And now all of a sudden you're talking to an advanced lifter. And it's like, by the way, when I say heavy, I mean 800 pounds each. And I'm like, Jesus, don't do both of those in the same day. Are you insane? Like, so as that athlete's capacity changes, and it's not necessarily, just a linear path, right? It's like at first, no, then yes, and then definitely no, right? Just based on what they're capable of. Now I want to shift gears a little bit here. So we talked about, 2009, 2010, neither you nor I had heard of sports science. Now sports science is very much a thing, and, NFL teams, Major League Baseball teams, a lot of universities have dedicated sports science professionals, sports scientists. So my question to you is, it seems to me like Europe was kind of ahead of the game, like European soccer, when it comes to sports science. What is your current state of the union as it pertains to sports science in America, and where do you see it going in the next handful of years?
Yeah, sports science is growing rapidly. Teams that are expanding, and it's been an evolution. We noted, 2010, let's say, it was very hard to find a sports scientist working in team sport environment. Then we got to the point where you started seeing some sports scientists come along. Generally, they were evolving from the S&C background initially. So a lot of times those positions were hybrid. I'm going to coach. And oh, by the way, in your spare time, collect catapult units of these GPS units, or we're going to do some monitoring with linear position transducers. So like velocity-based training type stuff. We're going to collect data. We're going to use that in some way. But it was almost an add-on to being an S&C coach. That's how most of the positions were started. Very few were they just, you're a sports scientist, this is what you do. And then we started evolving to where, okay, now it was a standalone position. Sports scientist, you collect the data, you handle positional tracking. Now we started getting more monitoring, these different things. And it's slowly evolved to the point now you're seeing positions being formed with staffs of people. So you have someone that's maybe a data science background. They've never been a strength coach. They may not even lift, but they have maybe a data science or data engineering background. So they know how to work with large data sets to create data infrastructures, or they know how to utilize different programming languages to analyze data, or an analyst, they know how to visualize using different tools, and they specialize in that. And then maybe you have someone with a physiology or biomechanics background that's running testing, and you have multiple different tools you're using to test. And so it's evolved to the point now where teams are rapidly expanding. So I have 2 full-time staff members, for example, on my staff, and that's, we're one NFL team. And you rewind, 10 years ago, and there was only less than a quarter of the NFL teams had a full-time sports scientist, even if you count people that are hybrid S&C coaches and sports scientists. So growing very rapidly. I think along with that is the it evolved from generally people from an S&C background. Now it's people, you might have someone that's more of the computer science background. You might have someone who, I was trained in formal biomechanics, and I've never coached, nothing like that. Now you may have people that come from more of a sports psych background. There's just the number of people that are getting into the field from these different disciplines, outside of your traditional background or S&C background, is increasing by the year. And so I would say the future of sports science, I think now, so related, kind of the European model of a high performance model. So you have a sports scientist, you have a strength coach, you have sports psychology, nutrition, these different areas, right? They all work together for performance, to enhance performance of the athletes in their different areas of expertise. And a lot of times functionally, this operated within what we refer to as a high performance model. So you have these different areas operating, and then someone overseeing these areas, that would sometimes be referred to as a high performance director, a performance manager, a performance director, whatever the title. And now in the US, we're moving more and more towards those types of models. And so with that becomes more of a need for data to be collected, information to be brought together to help these performance directors oversee holistic athlete development, because they're taking that information and they're piecing together, how can we ultimately help these athletes perform and maximize their availability? And they're bringing that information together, and they're helping decisions be made, but it's all predicated on having a lot of information available to make those decisions. And that's enhancing the importance of sports scientists, and also increasing the need for people with different skill sets and different areas of expertise within sports science, because now we need someone who can do a lot of testing and do it really well. Now we need someone that can provide really good, strong data infrastructures and do it really well. Now we need someone, and you're seeing this in the NBA and MLB, now we need someone who understands biomechanical data very, very well, can run a biomechanics lab very well for a team. Like these different things that even 10 years ago, I mean, wasn't really something that you thought was going to be happening in the near future. And so with that too, I think as we grow and these high performance models become more prevalent in US team sport, I think you're going to see sports science grow in terms of the number of people you have in these areas, but also grow in terms of salary expectations for those positions. The need for really good sports scientists, and that refers to some of those skills. So you're going to need the technical skill, but it's really going to be people that a desire for people, because to be a good sports scientist, you need to have the technical pieces, but you also need to understand, have general knowledge, but then also be able to merge that with the human relations, communication, emotional intelligence pieces. And so these are a lot of skills. It's not as simple as you're going to learn this one thing and you do this one thing really well, and this is a job and you'll excel and you'll move up the ladder. It's that you need to know a little bit about this, a little bit about this, maybe a lot about that, a little bit, and to piece that together. And then, oh, by the way, can you do this? So I think that is going to, those skills and those requirements are going to really, as you move up, a lot more is going to be required in terms of the sports sciences as you move up. And so really, I think that's kind of the future. Now, the one really good thing, and the thing that I've noticed, I get a lot of professors reaching out to me, a lot of grad students, a lot of people that are in different areas that are interested in being an applied sports scientist. And I always try to take the call. It could be, an undergrad I've never met, or it could be a professor from a D2 school in Minnesota. And I'm always going to take the call, because what I think is really cool is what we were talking about when, 2010 or when you were coming up, you didn't see these positions. So you didn't have it to say, oh, I want to go do that. How do I do that? And now you're looking and you're like, oh man, I wish I lucked into seeing
Mark,
something.
I'm 34. My life is over. I cannot learn a new thing. I cannot try a new thing. I'm basically dead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, you're 34. I mean, you're ancient. Well, and again, I think it's really cool that there's these positions that people look at. Maybe people look at what I do and they're like, look at what he does. Man, I want to do that. How do I do that? If I can have a conversation with someone and help give them some tips or something that helps them or inspires them, like I want to be able to do that because I think that I didn't see those people. And I know how critical that would have been if I had have seen those people, but the influence that would have had. I remember when I started in sports science, even when I got into my PhD and I was doing sports science at Virginia Tech, there was no other sports scientist there. My PhD advisor is an integrative physiologist. He could teach me physiology and research method, but he wasn't an applied sports scientist. No one there was. So I remember hopping on calls late at night with people all around the country who I would just reach out to, and they would be in the same boat as me, and we would just talk shop. And I'd say, I'm dealing with this. Oh yeah, I dealt with that. We would just help each other, share ideas, share insights. And like, I get so excited now being able to, get a student reach out or get a professor reach out. Like, how can I better prepare my students for these positions? Or a student reach out, hey, what are the steps to get in that type of role that you're in? And man, to think that I could provide some tips, provide some insight to help them, or even the fact that I'm mirroring something they want to do and it gives them hope and inspires them that like, oh, I want to do that. I see what I want to do being played out now and I can pursue that. I think that's so cool. And so I think, again, to the point of the growing field of sports science, and as we go, I think obviously the number of programs you're going to see at universities that offer these, we've already seen the growth, programs that are shifting, starting from new, but also increasing their offerings, programs that are shifting to more applied courses and more applied offerings, programs that are hiring more faculties, expanding. And so with that, I think you're going to see that growth as well, because I think now people are see these positions and it's getting up. It's things that I think people working in sport, working with science, technology, data, like it's I'm biased, but it's exciting work. And like, I think a lot of people see that and they want to pursue it. And so I think sports science is going to grow rapidly, and I'm excited for the future see where it goes in the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah, I remember still the first time that I saw a job posting for a legitimate, like, we want a professor of sports science for real. So the reason I say for real is my master's degree came from a department called exercise and sports science. There was zero sports science happening, right? It's just like a thing you call a department in America. But I remember seeing a posting for an SEC job saying, we want someone to come in here and be a professor who does sports science. And when I saw that, I said, oh, this is really catching on, right? Because now what's going to happen is that professor brings people in, builds out the infrastructure for a program. And, whether you like it or not, for better or for worse, in America, when a lot of people want to go and figure out what their career is going to be, they enroll at a university and say, in the next 4 years, I'm going to figure it out. And for the first time in essentially ever, now there are actually places where there is a professor who is saying, you want to do sports science, come into my lab. We do it. So instead of people having to, take your path, which I'm sure was extremely rewarding, but a lot of elbow grease, you're kind of seeking out every single kind of individual mentor from across the country and saying, hey, I heard this field exists. Would you be willing to take a call with me? Now we actually have those types of mentors integrating into traditional career pipelines of where people go to begin their career and learn the skills they're going to carry forward. Now, your previous answer was so comprehensive, you knocked out like 3 of my final questions. But correct me if I'm wrong here, because I don't want to have you just restate what you already said, but correct me if I'm misinterpreting. Because one of my questions was, a student now, but not even a student. Let's just say someone who says, maybe I want to start a career, maybe I want to change careers, and this is something I want to get into. One of my big questions was, what's the playbook for breaking into applied sports science in the current environment? And so what I picked up from your last answer is, you better know how the body works. You better know how bodies respond to training. You certainly should not be allergic to data, so some proficiency or comfort level with technology and statistics. And then aside from, and you need to be able to interact with people, because ultimately that's how these action items are getting transmitted, and that's how you're getting buy-in from the staff. Because, as well as, if you could have the perfect algorithm that says, the team ran too many sprints yesterday, we need to scale it down today. If the coach doesn't trust you, it fundamentally doesn't matter, right? Period.
100%.
So we need to have those core competencies, and it sounds like outside of that, most people are going to find that specialization area where they really drill down, whether it's, I'm a data science guy, I'm a statistics guy, biomechanics, physiology. Am I in the ballpark here? Is that really the playbook for someone who wants to say, I want to build my skills and kind of make my way into this profession?
Yeah, absolutely. You're spot on. I think those basics. So understand how the human body works. That's biology, that's anatomy, that's physiology, how the body responds. So your exercise physiology, your biomechanics, these elements that understand how the body functions, how the body responds. And then statistics. You got to have some background, some working knowledge of basics. Like, you don't need to be highly proficient in 4 programming languages and be able to have taken 2 years worth of advanced statistics, but you need to have the basics. And then you need to have the human relations element, understanding how to communicate to people, understanding how to read people, having some emotional intelligence, really understanding a social element there, right? Because team sport environments come with their own cultures, their own social dynamics. And so understanding those elements, and then some area of specialization is going to be developed. And I always tell people, as you're learning these different areas, expose yourself across all these different areas first before thinking, okay, I'm going to specialize in this, because you need to kind of test the waters in these different areas, because you might stumble on something that's a strength of yours that you weren't even aware of. And because I think your area of specialization really has to be something that you're passionate about, but something that there's naturally has an area of strength around it for you, because there will be that element. You just have to discover it. And then obviously you're passionate about that area. Like, I'm going to, really be situated in the data science area. And so, like, in terms of the preparation you take, the time you spend devoting yourself to that area, you're going to have some general working knowledge around, exercise technique, programming, physiology, these other elements, but you're going to hang your hat on being a data scientist. That's great. Or I'm going to understand all there is to know about testing and measurement. I'm going to be able to test the body in all these different ways, whether it's physiology, whether it's strength testing. I'm going to understand as much as I can about testing, how to develop protocols for testing, how to interpret tests, how to position the body in different ways to isolate certain musculature to be able to test it, and the relevance that has in medical settings and rehabilitation settings, whatever it is. That could be an area of specialization. It just needs to be something that you're passionate about and that you have a certain area of comfort with. And so, and finally, and this was something I'll just add on to that, is I think really in the sports science realm, because you have people coming from all these different backgrounds, we've talked about the dynamics in team sport environment. Something that I just think you always have to be is authentic, true to yourself, authentic in your interactions. You can have someone that comes, an introvert from a data science background, and place them in an NFL environment interacting with these athletes. There's going to be some interaction that has to take place if you're working as an applied sports scientist. There's got to be some things there that are going to push you outside your comfort zone, but never try to be something you're not. Be authentic, be yourself. And because people will respect that, and that's going to come off as a genuine, okay, this is who this person is, as opposed to mimicking something. And I say that partly too because you referenced at the beginning your personality and being a strength conditioning coach, which is loud, a lot of times loud, not always extroverted. Like, don't try to be that if you're not. That's coaching 101, right? Be yourself. And so I think it applies very much to really any context, but speaking here in terms of applied sports scientists, be authentic, be yourself. If you're an introvert, if you're quiet, be that. Be comfortable in who you are and what your skill set is, and people respect that. Athletes will respect you. It's people can always pick up, especially in these types of environments. People can pick up when you're being something you're not, or you're trying to put on a persona of being, I'm this person, I'm that way, because there's all these different personalities here, and you just have to be comfortable in being who you are, because you may be very different than the S&C coaches. You may be very different than the dietitian who, whatever it is. And so you really just have to be comfortable in who you are and be authentic.
Yeah, no, I've collected some data with some athletic teams here, and yeah, they know me as, the nerdy guy who comes by to pick up their urine from time to time, and like, you be yourself. Like if I try to go in there and act cool, like they're not going to buy it anyway, right? So why bother? But no, that's great. Yeah, what's really cool about sports science is it is what I had in my mind for what being a strength coach would be, until I reached that point where I was like, I don't think I have this profession down, right? So it's awesome that those roles are expanding, that it's a field in an area that's growing, and I appreciate you for giving our audience a little insight into what this field is, and a little bit of a blueprint for how would you build the types of skills that would be necessary for getting into it. And like you said, with sports science, with any specialization you want to develop in life, every person I know who's gotten really good at something, they'll pretty much tell you, when your aptitude overlaps with your passion, you'll look around, and once you find that one thing where you have that really good overlap, where you say, I actually have some skills here and I'm crazy about it, you never look back, right? So you can kind of sample these many different facets of sports science, and when you find that match, you'll probably know, you know what I mean? And you can take that and run with it. All right, so Marc, I really appreciate your time. I want to be respectful of it. I know you got Super Bowls to win and analyses to run and all that sorts of stuff. So the last thing I want to close with here, I know you've got all sorts of cool projects that you're working on. I don't know which ones you want to make available to the public out here, which ones you want to shout out, but if people want to stay in touch with you, if people want to check out some of these projects you're working on, where would you direct them?
Sure. Yeah, I would say Instagram, Twitter, at Marc, MARCT Lewis. And then I do have a book that I wrote with a good friend and colleague of mine, Adam Virgil, the Sports Science Handbook. Not a book about force plates and GPS and things like that. It's a book about really how to think and how to apply principles within our setting. And so very, very applicable to anyone wanting to work in this type of environment, but also applicable across really any area in terms of sports science exists everywhere, which is kind of what we've talked about here. So I think, would be very interesting to a lot of your listeners. And if you want to learn more about sports science, dive into some things. We are, myself and Adam, we're launching a business called the Sports Science Network, which is really all about connecting people to resources, connecting people to people. So maybe you're interested in sports science, helping you learn more about it, potentially connecting you to different types of people that can give you insight into working in this space based on your interests. And so that's where I kind of would say start. And again, I've mentioned it here, but I'm more than happy to chat with anyone. I love what I do, but also I think more than anything, I love helping people achieve what they aspire to, and whatever that looks like. So if you have questions, you're interested in chatting, I'm always open. Feel free to to message me, and I'll be more than happy to chat with you, and I'm more than happy to point you in the direction of whatever your interests are, and help in any way that I can.
Yeah, and I can vouch for that, Mark. You've been shockingly generous with your time. I've bothered you with some questions in the past. You've always made yourself available, so I really do appreciate that. Um, Make sure you send me over some links so that everyone listening can check out, all these projects that you're working on and stay in touch with you. So we'll make sure we put those in the show notes for everybody that's listening. Yeah, and the Sports Science Network, I'm excited to see how that grows, because I think that's going to be a really cool resource for everybody. And when it comes to the Sports Science Handbook, I have seen it myself with a privileged, ultra special proof copy before it's officially out. And it's great. And I think a lot of people are going to like that. Like you said, sports science is everywhere. So people who listen to this show, they may not say, you know what, I want to go be a sports scientist for an NFL team. But, you know, if you're listening to this show, you take a very analytical approach to your training variables, the way that you modify them. And I think those folks will get a lot out of just the kind of systems and approach to thinking that you kind of lay out in your book. You think that's accurate?
Absolutely. You said it much better than I did. I think it's about applying these principles, and very much, in, folks that enjoy understanding, is what I'm doing in the gym effective? What is my response to things? How can you're monitoring things, your strength and lifts, your body composition, your body weight on as a maybe potentially a control variable. As you modulate different things, you track what you're consuming from an energy standpoint, these different things. It's about applying these principles in whatever setting you're in, with yourself, personal training, with clients. And so, yeah, you, again, very well said, better than I did.
All right. Well, Mark, like I said, you're too generous with your time. I'm absolutely abusing it. So once more, I just want to thank you so much for joining us on Iron Culture. Everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Make sure you like, rate, subscribe, share with a friend, all that good stuff. And we will be back with another episode in 1 week.